One of the things I was told that was extremely discouraging and depressing to hear shortly after I started working at the office, somebody with a lot of credibility told me that there's no way I'm going to be able to do what I'm trying to do because without a college education, I'm not going to be sophisticated enough to hang with the kind of people that buy and sell real estate in San Francisco.
How Jeremy's career got started.
Not easy to articulate exactly how I ended up in sales and real estate more specifically because it's debatable exactly where when rather, the seeds were planted, but I'll do my best to walk you through it. I remember when I was about 11, my dad and I were on a fishing trip, and when we were coming home, we decided to stop by a garage sale, and which is something that we would do often back then. And my dad ended up buying this blue glass ashtray from an old casino called Stiffy's. And he paid $1 for it. And then we drove to an antique store and sold it right away for $15. And then we used the profits to go out to lunch that day. And, my dad didn't need to make $14 that day. He just wanted to do that to show me what it looks like to capitalize on knowledge. He knew that the ashtray was worth more than $1. He knew people collected those things, and so he decided to buy it, sell it, just to teach me a lesson, you could say. And I understood it as well as I could for an 11-year-old, but it definitely wasn't something I thought much about for a long time. It didn't really mean much to me in the moment. Fast forward a few years, as I was entering high school, this would have been the fall of 2008. Unfortunately, the 2008 recession absolutely devastated my family's financial situation. We ended up losing the home I grew up in. We lost all of our investments and we became dirt poor over the course of a couple of years. And so I started high school knowing that Bank of America was going to eventually evict us from our home. And there was not going to be any money to send me to college. There wasn't going to be any type of monetary help getting on my feet once real life started. So it was a lot to soak in at 14 years old, and it was quite change in pace from what I was used to. The summer after my freshman year ended, I was at the skate park one day, and I was there all the time growing up because I was part of a clique of boys that were really into BMX, and so we were at the skate park all the time. And one of our friends shows up on his bike, and he's all excited, and he tells us that he just found out that one of the local farms is going to hire a whole bunch of people to pick beans for $8.76 an hour. And all of us were just blown away at the prospect of picking beans for just $8.76 an hour. That's way more than minimum wage, and how hard could that be? And so we ended up applying for this job and we ended up getting it. And so every morning for most of the summer, we would stuff into my little tiny Ford Ranger, drive to the field, and we would get on our knees and pick beans until they told us to stop. The hours were different every day. And this job was brutal. We totally underestimated how difficult this would be because you get on your knees in the mud early in the morning with the dew, and there'd be tons of mosquitoes in the dew, and so your legs would get all bit up. And then by 11 a.m., it's blazing hot, and obviously there's no shade because it's a field. And then you get sent home, and now your day is ruined because you started it by picking beans in the mud in the sun. So that was my summer after my freshman year in high school. And my last paycheck before I had to quit to go back to school was $120. And so I had to quit because school started. And then when the school year started, the main thing on my mind was, well, what's going to be my next move for income? Because I couldn't rely on my parents for gas money or lift tickets to go snowboarding or anything like that. And so I didn't really have any ideas, and I knew that I was up against a very brutal job market. So I am from the Bay Area originally, Pacifica more specifically, but most of my childhood was spent in Nampa, Idaho. which was a very depressed area during the '08 recession. Jobs were so scarce where I grew up during this time that just entry-level fast food jobs would have dozens of applicants, and it was very hard for a teen to get a job like that because we were competing against adults who could work anytime, whereas we had to be in school. So it wasn't easy. I remember one time I applied for a job for an ad I saw on Craigslist for Liberty Tax. And the job was to dress up like the Statue of Liberty and shake a sign on a corner. It paid $7.25 an hour. So I apply for it. They schedule an interview and I show up at this place and they put me in a room with maybe 10 other people. And it turns out that everybody else in the room was also there to apply for this job. And every single person there was well into their adulthood. So here I am, a teen, just barely started my sophomore year in high school. I'm willing to do this job. But there was a guy who was 45 who showed up in a suit and tie applying for this job. But that's a snapshot into just how brutal this period of time was for people that were just trying to get by. And so I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't really have any good ideas, but I knew I needed to do something. I remember early in the school year, there was some type of assembly to celebrate the beginning of the school year. I didn't want to go to it. Neither did a bunch of guys that I was in class with. And so when everybody was pouring into the gym, several of us snuck out the back and we were standing around my truck in the parking lot waiting for that thing to end. And while we were standing outside talking, I remembered that one of the kids I was there with had a Redline BMX bike that my friend sold him, and he tried getting into BMX and he just wasn't interested, so I knew he wasn't riding it. And so I said, "Hey Nick, you should sell me your Redline for $35. And he said, $35? That's a ripoff. I don't want to do that. And I said, well, you're not riding it. What are you going to do with it? So you should just sell it to me. And he said, well, tell you what, I'll sell it to you if you give me a ride home today. And I said, okay, deal. But anyway, so I buy his bike for $35. I take it home. I go into my garage and I immediately strip the whole thing down to the frame. And I put all the parts in a box and I put the frame in the back of my truck and then I take it to the skate park. And over the course of a couple weeks, I ended up selling the frame and all of the parts for $100. And so I made $65 by just buying that bike, stripping it down, and then waiting for people to buy the parts. And I just thought that was incredible because it seemed like such a better deal than getting paid minimum wage to flip burgers or do some other kind of job like that. And so I made a mental list in my head of all the boys at my high school that I knew had BMX bikes in middle school that they weren't using anymore. And so eventually I picked through all the bikes that I could find through my small network at school. I decided to try my hand at picking up stuff on Craigslist. And so I would go on my computer after school and pull up the bike listings on Craigslist. And I would sit there and call all these ads and just give people lowball offers. And eventually I figured out that there was actually some technique that went into doing that. Because initially when I had no experience, I would get on the phone, sound very nervous and uncomfortable with what I'm doing and say, hey, you know, you're asking $200 for this bike. Will you sell it to me for $60? And they would just say no, and then the conversation would end, and I would move on to the next one. But eventually, I figured out that if you call somebody and ask questions about the bike and try to build a little bit of rapport over the phone, even if it's subtle, and then jump in with your offer and tell them, and I can come pick it up today, you know, just little hooks like that, that more people would say yes. Not a majority, but enough to where you could actually get somewhere. And so it wasn't long before I was regularly picking up great deals on bikes off of Craigslist and then selling them for double or triple what I was paying. That, in essence, was the beginning of my sales career in a general sense. Eventually, I moved on from just Craigslist as a source for where I'd find these bikes. I started to regularly check all the pawn shops and thrift stores. I'd find deals there. And then I would also go to police auctions. I'd get up early on Saturdays and go to these police auctions, and I would bid on anything that had some margins in it. And eventually I moved on to road bikes and mountain bikes. My income from flipping bikes went up quite a bit when I made that pivot, because now I wasn't just dealing with kids, I was dealing with adults. I remember there was a stump jumper full suspension mountain bike that I paid $220 for, and then I sold it a week or two later for $500. I never had that kind of a spread with a BMX bike. And so in the process of flipping all these bikes, I ended up gaining a ton of very unique skills that you don't learn in school and that most people never have an organic opportunity to learn. I learned so much about negotiating from doing this. I learned how much your tone of voice matters, just little things you can say and when to say them and when to pause when you're trying to have a negotiation. This is stuff that's very hard to teach people, and I was able to learn a lot of it organically by flipping bikes. And I figured out that I was making just as much or maybe a little bit more than I would if I had a minimum wage job after school with the amount of hours that I could work versus the minimum wage. I ended up making about that much or a little bit more, but I was having a lot of fun, which I would not have had at that job, and I got to be my own boss. And so having this bike business revealed to me that in the long run, as an adult, I knew that I wanted to be self-employed. And I knew that my natural inclination was something geared towards sales. It's very important for people at some point, as soon as possible, to figure out roughly where your natural inclinations are and where they're not. Growing up, I was not a great student. I wasn't really into school. I didn't want to just sit there and read a book and have to write about it. And I also knew that I wasn't very good at working with my hands. But buying all these bikes and selling them and looking for deals and talking to people, that felt natural and it never felt forced. And so around the time that I got really into this, I made the decision for a lot of different reasons that I wanted to move back to California and I wanted to be a realtor. And I decided that I was going to do the realtor thing, not because it sounded fun or because I thought I would just enjoy it. I did it because I knew I had to do something as soon as possible to earn a living, because my parents were just not in a position to subsidize me in school or so I could try one thing or another and see what I liked. It wasn't about what I liked. It was just born out of necessity. And so flipping bikes taught me that I wanted to be self-employed, and it gave me a lot of valuable sales and negotiating experience. And so as crazy as it sounds, it was kind of an organic pivot. My high school years were really dedicated to saving up money and going back to California. And so throughout my sophomore and junior year, I was just flipping bikes as often as I could, but I ran into an issue, which was it was very hard to sell bikes and stack up cash that way during the winter, because the winters in Idaho are pretty harsh and it's hard to find people that want to buy bikes when there's 6 inches of snow on the ground. And so I ended up reluctantly going back into the workforce. There was a Little Caesars that opened up. And so I was a little bit late to the party applying for a job there, but ended up being hired to be their sign waiver. I have to take a moment to explain this job and how awful it was. It's fun to talk about now, but it wasn't funny at the time. So I was paid $7.25 an hour to stand at one of the busiest intersections in our town and wave a Little Caesars sign about our $5 pizzas. And I had to wear an orange vest that said hot and ready on the back in big, bold black letters. So that was my job. I remember my first day on the job, my boss told me that at the top of every hour, I can come inside and sit down and take a break for 10 minutes. And so I go out there for the first time, and right off the bat, I'm recognizing tons of people as they drive by, because this is the busiest street in town. So tons of kids from my school are driving by and they're seeing me doing this, and it's pretty embarrassing. And after standing out there for a while, all of a sudden I went, no, I forgot to take my break at the top of the hour. And so I looked at my phone and only 17 minutes had gone by, whereas I felt like I had been out there forever. So as soon as I saw that, I knew that I was in for a very rough road. And I ended up working that job my entire junior year, which was really my senior year, because I ended up signing up for this program where you could take summer school to skip a whole grade and graduate as a junior. And so that's what I ended up doing. But I had to have this job. And so what I would do is I would take my paychecks. I would make like around, $600 a month. I would take my Little Caesars paychecks and I would invest all of the money I could into bikes wherever I could find them. And that was how I stacked up cash faster, was using my paychecks as extra capital to go get more bikes. And so even though the winter was a harder time to make money, I was still making something. I just wasn't as much, and it wasn't enough to save up and move to the Bay Area, obviously. In hindsight, it was the perfect gig for me because I was able to text and talk on the phone while I was out there. And so this allowed me to make appointments to sell bikes and parts and things after work. And so I was able to jump on a lot of opportunities, whereas if I worked at a restaurant inside or something, I couldn't get away with that. So it was a blessing at the time, even though it was difficult. But anyway, I graduated high school in the spring of 2011, and I didn't want to be a high school graduate being a sign guy at Little Caesars. And so I ended up getting a job at Fred Meyer, which for those of you who don't know, it's like this chain of grocery stores that are common in the Northwest. My job was to just push the carts back into the stalls inside the store, run errands for the cashiers, and then clean the bathroom. I worked that job for a couple of months. I think they were paying me like $8.50 an hour. I absolutely hated it with a passion. Everything about it I just thought was horrible, and I really wanted to quit, but I was afraid of losing my income. But I had this feeling that if I went back to selling bikes full time, that I could make more than I would working at that store and then doing bikes on the side. And so I decided to roll the dice and quit that job and then just do bikes full time. And I ended up making more money doing that than I ever did in the past, including the period of time where I was getting my Little Caesars income and flipping bikes. And so in the fall of 2011, I was able to convince my grandpa, who lived in Burlingame, California, which is close to where I wanted to work and be. I convinced him to let me stay with him. And so when I was 17, I left home and I drove to California and moved in with my grandpa. I lived alone in his house for a couple months because he was really sick and he was living with one of my aunts at the time. And so I was living alone in a house at 17, which was a weird feeling. My goal was to get down here and get my real estate license and eventually become a full-time San Francisco realtor. That was my vision. And my plan in the meantime was to get a job at a grocery store or something and then try to flip bikes on the side and get my real estate license as soon as I could and then make that transition somehow, some way. I didn't really have all the answers, but that was kind of my general plan. As I was gearing up to move to California, I had a little under $6,000 in the bank, and my hope was that one of my dad's old business partners that was an agent in the city would help me by hiring me as his assistant or something, some kind of apprenticeship or shadowing to help me get into the business. Really what I was hoping for is just hire me as an assistant. I'll do whatever. I just need a job where I can be somewhere adjacent to real estate. After I was down here for about a month, I gave him a call. And so I showed up at his office, and I remember I wore these black Dockers and a teal button-up shirt that I did not tuck in because I thought tucking your shirt in looked dorky. And then I wore some black running shoes. That's how I showed up to the most important interview of my life at that point. We sit down and I explain my situation and what I'm hoping to do. He wasn't doing that great at the time himself. I mean, this was still 2011 and, a pretty rough economy. But he ended up offering me a job, and our arrangement was that I would work for him as his assistant for 4 years at about $1,500 a month. He would get half of any of the commissions that I brought in during those 4 years. My main function when I started working for him was I would show up at the office in San Francisco first thing in the morning, and I would get on this website that had a list of all the fresh notices of default. And I would drive around the city and knock on their doors and see if they were interested in maybe doing a short sale. I would try to get their phone numbers and then bring them back to my boss, and he'd follow up with them when he could. And so every day for, I don't know, close to 2 years, I was driving around the city, usually in the rougher neighborhoods, and talking to people that were behind on their mortgage and trying to collect those phone numbers. I did sign up for the classes to get my real estate license shortly after I started working there. And so once I was done with that, I applied for an appointment to take the state exam for my real estate license. And I remember when I filled out the application, I got a letter from the state a few weeks later saying that there must be a mistake on my application on the birth date. And I figured out that it was because I was 17 at the time that I was applying, but I knew it wasn't going to be an issue because I was going to be 18 by the time the test had been scheduled. And so I had to explain that. And so that's just kind of a funny thing I remember. And thankfully, I passed the test. Shortly after getting my license, I was still back to doing the same stuff that I had been doing. And so once I was done with that, I was back to work working for my boss. And around that time, he and some of his friends bought a house to flip on 42nd and Rivera. And they listed that house for $699, and it ended up selling for 800 grand. And at the time, 800 was a big number for a house out there. And so I made a flyer about that property, about how it was listed for $699 and sold for 800. And I knocked on all the doors on that block telling people about it. And then I asked them some kind of open-ended question, like, how long do you plan on staying here? Or, something to that effect. And I figured initially I was just going to hit all the doors on that block. But then once I was done, I figured, well, I guess I can tell everybody on 42nd Avenue about this because it's relevant to them too. So after a few weeks, I ended up hitting every house on 42nd Avenue. And then when I was done, I figured, well, I guess I can tell everybody on 41st Avenue. And so before I knew it, I ended up knocking on every house in the Outer Sunset and Parkside district. And so there's thousands of houses out there. And it took me a long time, but I ended up knocking on every house out there with that flyer. And what happened in the short run was, so just like throughout 2012, I didn't get any listings from it. But what I did collect was a huge list of names, numbers, and addresses of people that were interested in selling at some point. And so I slowly started to build up a database of people that might want to sell, and I was keeping in touch with them as best I could. It was pretty awkward and clunky at first. But I kept knocking every day, and in 2013, I ended up getting my first listing from that. Later that fall in 2013, I ended up getting a listing where I knocked on the door, and then maybe a month later, they decided to sell, and so I got that one and sold it. But my main priority in 2012, after getting my license, aside from doing the work that I was doing for my boss, was, knocking on doors in the avenues and trying to get listing leads. And so in 2013, I had 2 listings. I ended up continuing with the door knocking routine and doing open houses and things on the weekends for 8 years. I knocked on doors almost every day from the middle of 2012 all the way through March of 2020. The 4-year agreement between my boss and I ended, and so in January of 2016, I was officially completely on my own and an independent agent. I know that in 2013, I think I had 6 or 7 sales. A couple of them were from door knocking, a couple of them were from floor time, and one of them was my grandpa's house. Unfortunately, he had passed away. And so in 2014, I had a handful of sales, didn't do much, but had, maybe 6 sales, something like that. In 2015, that was kind of the turning point. I ended up having 5 or 6 listings from door knocking. And those were mostly people that I met a couple years prior, where I collected their name and number and kept in touch with them. So it's not like I just got the listing a week after hitting their door or something. Those were people I kept in touch with for a couple years. And so 2015 was the beginning of my early efforts actually starting to pay off. And, I sold 10 homes that year and made about 100 grand. And that was a big deal for a 21-year-old. That was the turning point for me, was around that time. And so I became very serious and very invested in my geographic farm. And it was a logical place for me to go in the real estate business, because when you get into real estate, a lot of people will tell you that you have to start with your sphere of influence. Tell everybody that you know that you're a realtor and to think of them when people are buying and selling. And that is a good idea, but the issue is that when I moved to the Bay Area, I was 17. I knew hardly anybody, and there just was no sphere of influence for me to lean on. So I had to go create my own. And so I made my sphere of influence the Outer Sunset and Parkside District. That ended up being the foundation of my business. And so by about 2016 or 17, thereabouts, I was making enough money in my farm to invest in things like direct mail, digital advertising, kind of these more passive tools for getting listings instead of just door knocking every day. But I did the door knocking thing every day, like I said, from the middle of 2012 until the early part of 2020, Monday through Friday and sometimes Saturday. I mean, that was such a big part of my life in my 20s, was just doing that. And it was worth doing, but it was incredibly difficult. By 2016, I had become the top agent in the neighborhood. I was able to say, honestly, that I was the #1 realtor in the Outer Sunset and Parkside District. And so that kind of became the identity of my real estate business. And it just kind of snowballed from there and ended up selling, I don't know how many hundreds of millions of dollars worth of property, largely from door knocking. My mailings, my digital ads, all that kind of stuff would not have helped me if it wasn't for all those years that I spent knocking on doors. And so when I look back at this whole thing, like I said, it's hard to pinpoint exactly where the seeds were planted. One thing I never like to see is when somebody has had success in something, regardless of what their field is. For most people, their natural inclination is to make themselves the hero in the story and make it all about them and what they did. I know our culture really idolizes the self-made man and kind of puts him on a pedestal. I started with a lot less than most people. I didn't have much to work with, and I was pretty close to the bottom from like where you can start. And I was a very unlikely candidate for success because I was just a high school teenager who didn't even grow up in the Bay Area, just was technically from there and, trying to make it in real estate. But I would never call myself a self-made man, because there are 3 men in this story that gave me a huge leg up, and that was a leg up that I didn't do anything to earn. I just happened to have it. The first one is obviously my dad. He had a 14-year real estate career before we moved to Idaho, and then got back into the business when I was about to start middle school. So it's not a coincidence that I gravitated towards real estate after becoming interested in sales. I know most people would assume I inherited his old book of business and was taught door knocking lines before I could read, but I paid little attention to his career for most of my childhood because it was only later that I decided to get into real estate. So I can't really say that I was raised in it. He tried to leverage his old contacts for me when I got started, but nothing ever panned out. Regardless of that, he supported me as much as he could, and there's no doubt that's a big part of my success. Another thing he did that left an impression on me is insisting that I read The Richest Man in Babylon, which is an amazing book about personal finance and wealth building. It was pretty heavy reading for a 6th grader, but definitely left a lasting impression on me. Most parents wouldn't do that for their kids. The other man in this story that I have to give a shout out to, I'm not going to say his name because I want to respect his privacy. My dad's old business partner giving me a shot when I was obviously not a good candidate for an assistant in an office. I didn't even know how to send a fax. And that was an important skill in 2011. I didn't know how to tie a tie. I didn't know that I was supposed to tuck my shirt in. I mean, I knew less than nothing. he took a chance on me because of his relationship with my dad. And so that's not something that I earned. I absolutely earned my keep at the office, but I didn't earn my initial foot in the door. That was just something that I got to have. Something else I should point out is that even though I was working for another realtor who was very established and my dad had a lot of contacts in San Francisco, neither of them ever gave me any leads that turned into business. I think maybe 7 or 8 years into my career, I had a listing where there was some connection to my dad, somebody he knew, but that was it. My boss did give me some leads when I first started, but I blew through all those and was unsuccessful in making anything happen with them. And so I wasn't handed any business. I was just handed an opportunity. And then, of course, my grandpa for letting me live with him the last year and a half of his life. I paid all my own bills, but I wasn't paying rent. And so, between the three of those guys, everything that they brought to the table, they were all a huge part of my success. And so that's why I would never call myself a self-made man, because I absolutely had a lot of help. And I don't say this out of guilt. I don't feel bad about having those advantages. I know that I started as close to the bottom as most people ever will, but I just want to be clear that I don't have the audacity to call myself a self-made man. I had a lot of help, and I'm grateful for that. So anyway, that's the story of how I got into the business, and I hope that this helps people, especially young people, try to gather their own thoughts and figure out what kind of trajectory could make sense for them. Keep in mind that even unlikely candidates for success, which is what I was, they can make it if they want it bad enough. One of the things I was told that was extremely discouraging and depressing to hear shortly after I started working at the office, somebody with a lot of credibility told me that there's no way I'm going to be able to do what I'm trying to do because without a college education, I'm not going to be sophisticated enough to hang with the kind of people that buy and sell real estate in San Francisco. And the scary thing for me in hearing that was the person who said it had a lot of credibility, and I didn't know if that was true or not. That was something no one ever told me. And so it scared me because I knew I wanted to do this, but I also knew I couldn't afford to just be in school for a handful of years. I mean, who's going to pay my bills? I needed to eat. And so it was very depressing and scary to hear that. And basically, I was just hoping that he was wrong. But, I knew that only time would tell. So not only have I had a productive career, but I've also had a lot of very extraordinary clients. People that a lot of folks would make a lot of assumptions about. I've represented a judge on multiple occasions. I once sold a couple properties for one of the top investment bankers in Silicon Valley. I've had a lot of pretty sophisticated clients over the years, and it's not because I'm sophisticated. I'm definitely not. But I learned a long time ago that if you don't talk about things that you don't know about, and you only lean into things that you do know something about, and you are yourself 24/7, some percentage of people will respect you and feel comfortable working with you.